The question is what explains the great enrichment, right, in the modern world. We do live in revolutionary times, right, historically speaking. Chances are good that you don't think of yourself as a rich person, but if you are alive in the 21st century, by all historical standards, you are astoundingly prosperous. Perhaps not astoundingly if you live in some of the poorest countries of the world, but even by world historical standards, people living in the poorest countries are wealthy. Let me give you just a couple of numbers here. Economists and social scientists will try to measure income productivity across history, and it's a very difficult social science project. But if you imagine a timeline that goes back 10,000 years and then 20,000 years, right, and 30,000 years, and you are to plot income for the world, the standard estimate is that people lived in all cultures at all times for that 30,000 year or so stretch on about $200 per year, if you take, say, 2010 American dollars as one standard. So just imagine almost 30,000 years, right, of people living on $200, right, per year. And life expectancy is very short. Right, at birth, on average, it's less than 40 years. But starting with around 500 years ago, there's a slight uptick in that number. And by the time we get to the 1500s and on into the 1600s, kind of at the turn of the modern world, Columbus crosses the ocean, the earliest era of globalization, other things are at work in the world. The number goes up to perhaps the world average of about $400 dollars a year. And that's a doubling, which is a significant increase in a short period of time, right, historically speaking. If we then advance another 200 years to around 1700 or so, that number has increased to, say, $600 dollars per year world average. And again, that's significant because that's a tripling of the world historical average for millennia. But then what the economic historians and others call the Great Enrichment takes off, particularly in the 1700s, and what had been a flat line that starts to inch up and almost goes vertical over the course of the next 2 centuries, until by the time we get to the year 2000, right, the turn of the 20th century, the world average income is over $6,000. And what that means is that in less than 300 years, on average, world income has increased by 10 times. People are on average 10 times. And of course, that's an average. If you take the very richest countries in the world, in many cases, they are earning $30,000 per year. And the countries that are the poorest of the world are at $1,000, $2,000, and some terrible cases still below $1,000. But this had never happened before, ever in human history. It started to happen in the 1700s. And so then the question is, what explains, right, this really astonishing improvement, right, in the human condition. And I think this is, of course, an important question for all intellectuals to grapple with, partly because part of the explanation, of course, is going to turn on economics and technology and science and politics and religion and so forth. So all intellectuals are going to make a contribution to the overall explanation. But it's a question that should be of interest to all of us, right? Even as average citizens who don't spend a lot of time doing economic theory and political history, right, and so forth, because while it's wonderful to live, right, in prosperous times and to have all of the opportunities that are available to us and to take that for granted so that we can go on trying to live fulfilling lives, it's also important for us to understand, right, what has made that possible so that we don't make huge cultural mistakes and destroy things that have made it possible for us to achieve what we've achieved in the modern world. So if we try to start explaining it, I won't give a full explanation here. This is a fascinating set of issues, and part of what the free organization is concerned with addressing. It's very natural to say, well, one of the things that happened in the 1700s, of course, was the Industrial Revolution. And that was an astonishing revolution in engineering, and engineering particularly applied to business to enable mass production. The most famous landmark here perhaps is James Watt with his invention of the steam engine, and steam engines don't get tired. They can continue to work. And so technology and the technological revolution that certainly picked up steam in the 1700s is a huge part of the explanation. Another part of the explanation, though, is also science, and in some cases, science works hand in hand with technology. Scientists will discover new things in chemistry, new things in physics, and in many cases, those very abstract scientific discoveries can then be picked up by engineers who then can do all sorts of technological things. So there was a scientific revolution that had started to occur in the 1600s and certainly had picked up steam by the 1700s. So we have a technological revolution and a scientific revolution. But another point worth mentioning here is that engineering and science are very expensive, enterprises. How can we afford all of these scientists with all of this time to do all of these experiments and to travel to conferences and so forth? How can we afford to have all of these inventors and engineers building and designing machines for mass production? Science and technology are very expensive enterprises, and typically they only take place in prosperous nations. So where did all of the money come from that is supporting all of these new enterprises? And then the economists come along and say, well, we also have to take into account that there had been an economic revolution that had occurred. Feudalism was breaking down. Serfs were freed from the land. There's the rise of the middle class that's able to own property and to mortgage and to trade. And there are international trading networks that are going on. And one of the, course, capstone projects here is in 1776. Adam Smith writes a book called The Wealth of Nations, identifying that to a large extent we now have a free market economy, or what later came to be called capitalism, and that came to be a dominant economic institution, which has been enormously economically productive. But then we can also say, but that's not the whole story, just because, if you're going to be a scientist, you need to have a certain amount of freedom. Freedom to challenge traditional beliefs, freedom to think outside of the box, to have lots of arguments and so forth. If you are going to have a free market economy, obviously people have to have a lot of freedom. So if you're going to have people being more intellectually free and more free in an economic and a business sense, that means you have to have a certain kind of politics, a politics that takes freedom seriously. And then the political theorists will point out that also in the 1700s we had a series of political revolutions. There had been a glorious revolution a little bit earlier in Britain, the American Revolution, the French Revolution a little bit later and a little bit more tragically, but all of them having the effect of breaking down the old static feudal orders and opening up a lot of free space. But of course, this is not the complete explanation altogether. If you're going to give people a lot of freedom, and you think that they can run their lives, there are certain philosophical views about human nature. If you're going to think that it's okay for people to pursue profit and to ask uncomfortable questions and to challenge traditional dogmas, then you're going to have certain philosophical views. And so there are philosophical revolutions that have been occurring in the 1600s and on into the 1700s as well. Now, the point is not to answer decisively, this great question about why the Great Enrichment occurred. It's a fascinatingly complex question, but it's an important question for us to take up and to understand, and it's an ongoing project. Partly, an institution like FREE is taking this up because here we are in free countries or in successful countries, and all countries will complain about their politics, and of course some countries have very serious political problems, and in many cases there's a temptation to try to make political changes directly in order to solve various kinds of problems. I think one of the lessons, though, of the Great Enrichment is that it didn't start with politics. One of my favorite recent sayings is the saying that culture eats politics for breakfast. And that is to say, before you're going to be able to successfully enact various kinds of political reforms, whatever you think those should be, The culture has to be prepared for it, right? And culture is a very complicated, right, set of institutions, a set of practices, sets of beliefs that large number of people have to have in place. And we can see this in various examples where if we try to say, well, we will just take democratic Republican institutions to various kinds of places. If all you do is just put democratic and political, Republican rather, institutions in place, that doesn't necessarily work. There are lots of examples where those institutions are put in place, but you end up back in a dictatorship, right, one generation later. It's not simply a matter of technology, say that the struggling nations need more of the high-tech, the advanced technologies that the successful nations have been able to develop. Lots of examples, unfortunately, of taking machinery and high technology right over to struggling cultures, giving it to them and teaching them how to use it, but then unfortunately a generation later the technology is just rusting in a field or rusting in a small factory and not being used. So there's a fascinating set of cultural questions and economics and religion and philosophy and politics and family life and the decisions that we all make as individuals interplaying right with each other. They deserve right to be taken up by the successful countries. We need to be able to understand it self-consciously, why we are successful, so that we can continue to support those institutions that make it possible for us to be successful. And then for those countries that have not yet become successful and are still struggling, what can they learn, right, culturally from the nations that have gone before successfully, that they can then adapt to their own circumstance to improve their condition, so that this great enrichment that started in the 1700s and really has been spectacular at lifting billions of people right out of poverty, raising average life expectancy around the world to about 70 now, around 80 for the very prosperous nations as well, so that all human beings right in our generation and the next generation can continue to enjoy the fruits of it.